Norman, thank you so much for agreeing to do this conversation today. Of course, Norman needs no introduction. Norman is not only a true great pioneer of architecture, of urbanism, but of course also, and we're going to talk about that also today, with the Norman Foster Foundation, has created this amazing foundation as a cross-disciplinary platform to think about the future, of the city. And as Mike said, it's such an important moment now, at the moment of this crisis, to think about the future with optimism. I also wanted to thank Elena. We always need to thank the amazing Elena for her passion, advocacy for the arts, for the Serpentine, also during such testing times, and of course for always believing in art, architecture, and urbanism, to quote Gerhard Richter, as being the highest form of hope. And we thought with Norman today to discuss different topics. As Mike said, we're going to discuss, of course, the current moment and what that means for the future of cities and of architecture. But I wanted to begin with ecology. And actually, because Mike and Norman, of course, had a meeting of minds, as Norman once said, working on the Bloomberg European headquarters, which is the most sustainable office building in the world, and actually also a great masterwork, a great masterpiece. So Norman, I wanted to ask you maybe to begin with that and tell us a little bit about your collaboration with Mike, about the Bloomberg headquarters, and how you made that such a completely sustainable office building.
I think that the whole issue of sustainability, energy, wellness, they're all totally linked. If we compare the Bloomberg building with a typical office building, Bloomberg pulls fresh air from the outside and it moves that air through the building, it exhausts it, it's working with nature. In that sense, it's reducing the energy because it's using, for most of the year, in a temperate climate, the outside air at a usable temperature. It's reducing energy. That's the opposite of so many buildings, which are sealed buildings and which recirculate stale air. So in one sense, pioneering the building of the future in Bloomberg and other examples which I could give you, I think that the coronavirus is going to hasten the inevitable developments towards buildings which work with nature, consume less energy, and are very much about wellness.
And of course, what is so fascinating is when we started actually to work on our Back to Earth ecology project at the Serpentine and decided to focus on ecology for the next 50 years on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Serpentine, we studied your pioneering work from the 60s and 70s, and ecology has played such a fundamental role from the very beginning of your work. And we did a long conversation in the Engadin, Norman, a few months ago, where you told us about these very early ecological projects. For example, the urban plan for La Gomera. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came so early to ecology and about some of these early projects?
Well, really, in the 1960s, we were, I think, reflecting some trends then, which were evident in writings like Carson, Silent Spring, warning about the danger of pesticides to a fragile planet. You had Buckminster Fuller operating manual for spaceship Earth. So there was this very early awareness, and we were very much part of that movement. So the earliest buildings were talking about harnessing solar energy, recycling human waste into fertilizer, desalinization. They were about decentralizing. They were questioning a lot of the things that were taken for granted. This was very much a fringe movement at that time. Of course, it's now a groundswell, and sustainability is called, the green movement. It hadn't been given those words at that time. So there's a continuity between projects from the past and projects now, which challenge, in a way, conventional thinking. And I think that one of the effects of the coronavirus will be to call into question many of the systems which air condition buildings and which rely on recirculating air within the building. So you have a great dependence on the filtering systems. I think you'll see a move towards those buildings where we've pioneered decentralization, where we're working with nature, but using sophisticated technology to control the opening and closing of the facades.
Now, in the same conversation in the Engadine, you were also telling me about the climate office. And I think the climate office is also a very interesting project in relation to the current moment of the coronavirus, of thinking about different spaces. And you were telling me that actually a mini version of the climate office is going to be realized at the Château Lacoste in Provence. So as that will be one of the future projects, it would be great to hear a little bit about that, how you revisit such a visionary early ecological project and bring it into the present, into the future.
It's an opportunity to go back into that past and to be able to recreate a project now with the advances in technology that we have. So, so a lot of the, how can I say, the recommendations that we were making was about a building that would be healthier, as well as consuming less energy. That, I think, takes on a new meaning in a world where even if we have a vaccine that will enable us to inhabit essentially unhealthy buildings, we'll always be thinking round the corner, what if there's another wave, or something which has the same effect but by a different name. And in a way, historically, we're seeing a repeat of a cycle, whether that's going back to the 1920s, 30s, or whether it's going back to the Middle Ages. So I think that, and the coronavirus, I think, will expedite, will make some things that were going to happen anyway, will make them happen faster.
And of course, with the climate office, that happens on a smaller scale. You've also worked on such sustainable projects on a very large scale. And I will never forget when we went together with you and Elena to visit Oskar Niemeyer. Oskar was 102 years old, and it was actually the first time you and Oskar met. We wanted to get the two of you together, which was Elena's and my idea, and make a film and a book about this encounter. It was an extraordinary encounter. And Oskar told us, of course, about Brasilia and about this idea of invention of a city from scratch. And you were talking about Mastar. And I found these notes today about Mastar, where you actually said we can learn from traditional spaces. It's very pedestrian friendly. In a way, the whole Mastar project is also really interesting in relation to the current moment.
Yes, it's a cliche, but it has been said, if you want to look far ahead, first look far back. And if you go back in the desert to an age before cheap energy, electricity, modern services, where you had to work with nature, where you were using vegetation, water for evaporative cooling, shade, orientation. We applied those lessons to Masdar so that we could, before we even started with modern technology, we were creating something which would work with nature, would work with the wind, would work with solar. And then using modern technology, able to demonstrate that you could have a research institute that would function every day of the year, 24 hours, energy consuming, and also feed back energy into the local grid, so totally solar powered. I think the lessons of that is you have to learn from history, from the past, and you apply the state-of-the-art technology. And you improve the quality of life, you make something healthier. And it also addresses the issue of climate change, of global warming.
Now, another project which came to my mind is, of course, a project you once referred to as introducing lungs, like a pair of lungs for the city. And that resonates a lot with the current moment. How can we reintroduce more space to breathe. And you actually said that in relation to an unrealized project, which was the Prado Museum extension. Can you tell us about this idea of introducing these lungs into the city?
I think the whole idea of the way in which an individual building can contribute to the wider community by creating public space, by giving something back to the community. I think that is it's quite a historic tradition. In a way, that's been lost in the modern movement. The idea of a building in isolation, but really we have to be thinking much more holistically in terms of not just the buildings, but the connections between buildings, whether that's public space, whether it's the public transport systems, because that combined is probably relating to, depending on how you calculate it, between 50 to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions measured in terms of energy. So really thinking holistically about those separate elements, thinking about them together, that I think is very important.
Another thing which we could observe a lot, of course, over the last weeks is that a lot of people actually moved temporarily to the countryside, and that leads us to another project of yours, which I'm very fascinated by, which is the Punt project. We visited together Punt earlier this year. Punt is in Switzerland, in the Engadine, and you want to build community centers there. And I remember you were talking about this idea that villages are shrinking because the younger generation moves to the city. And you were talking about this idea of the countryside, of Punt, of a small village, being a kind of a third space. And I think that would be great to hear more about that in the current climate.
I think that the move from rural areas to the cities, whether that is one extreme in an emerging economy, is creating the favelas, or whether it's in our more westernized societies where we're seeing, whether that's Spain or France or Switzerland, we're seeing the future of villages where agriculture has become far more mechanized. It's not dependent on the family unit any longer. So there is, and the village that you mentioned, Punt, for example, 800 people, 40 in 1 year, young people left for the attractions of the city because there weren't jobs. The tourist industry was in decline, as I was saying, agriculture. So the idea of creating a third place, very much about lifestyle. So how do you attract somebody from working at home, working in office, offering a lifestyle opportunity to be able to have the benefit of an alpine sports, leisure, brainstorming, and how do you use that to sustain a village? So this is the idea of a hub, a third place that will encourage local producers, shops to inhabit it, to create a venue, a new kind of working tourist, if you like. And that is in this wonderful democratic tradition here that has been voted for by the village. So individuals have had their say. The very interesting parallel move is that younger people in that community are also moving into politics. I think the average age of the councillors must be probably 30 or under 30. The youngest is, I think, 18. So very interesting trends in terms of younger generations.
And to then come from Punt back to the city, as Mike said, it would be important that we discuss also the future of big cities, of global cities. Roland Barthes wrote this amazing book from his seminars. It's actually the notes from his seminars. It's called How to Live Together. And he asks in this book, which is an incredible book to read right now, whether it's possible to create a community where everyone lives according to their own rhythm. and yet respects the individual rhythm of others. And so I was curious, now with social distancing and the corona crisis, how do you see the future of global cities, of very big cities?
I think that if you look at other disciplines, other needs, we've seen over time a recent move to decentralization. It wasn't that long ago that we had public laundries, which employed huge numbers of people. And then the robot came along in the form of the washing machine. It wasn't that long ago that a telephone exchange in every city would employ thousands of people moving plugs. And we've seen the way that a handheld instrument has totally transformed that. I think that the effects of this pandemic has been to perhaps call into question some of the issues of centralization, of supply chains. So perhaps cities, already the national, the big power grid in California last summer, you had 2.5 million people because of the problems of the infrastructure of the big grid. 2.5 million people who didn't have electricity. They were trying to buy portable generators so that they could be independent. So I think that we will see in individual buildings, in the relationship between nations, and in the workings of the city, we will see much more a move to decentralization, to more autonomy. And in that process, rather like the book that you've been quoting, much more control by the individual and smaller groups, less vulnerability to the big system. Now, I think that the possible political downside of that is, as you have greater independence, the potential for greater nationalism. But I think that the move towards smaller communities being more self-sustaining is very, very positive, whether that's in agriculture or whatever.
And of course, the research for that brings us to the Norman Foster Foundation, because a lot of these topics are actually analyzed in your workshops. And the Norman Foster Foundation in Madrid, which works globally, is very much about bringing all the disciplines together to discuss the future of city, the future of architecture, of urbanism. Can you tell us a little bit about the foundation? Because it's also very important, because at the Serpentine, it's not only ecology we focus on, but also inequality is a very important topic. We're working on a research project with Park in Dagenham, where artists are in residence. And again, that's a theme you have addressed a lot, particularly in some of the bigger researches with the foundation. For example, with the campaign where you raise awareness of the plight of slum dwellers. And you do that not only as a research project, but also very concretely, actually with the Tata Trust and with the province of Odisha, in terms of production of reality. So it would be great to hear a little bit about the foundation, how you address such urgent topics there as research, and particularly in relation to the slum dwelling project, so relevant in terms of the current crisis in the world, how you then implement this through politics and business into concrete reality.
If we take the two parallel streams of education, of workshops, of public debates, then gathering from around the world, say 10 top graduates, most likely to be influential in their cities, in their communities, as civic leaders of the future. So anticipating that future, bringing them together with 10 mentors, the top people in the world on issues of climate change, of inequality, of power distribution, of slums, the plight of a huge proportion of humanity, 14% currently, over 1 billion without access to clean water, sanitation as we know it, power, electricity. So that in parallel, working with government, as you say, in the case of Odisha, and a team on the ground with a two-step program. The first proposition being that these are communities of hope and not despair, and that the last thing they want to do is to see their community bulldozed and relocated because they're actually vibrant communities with a very, very extraordinary level of awareness of the potential of those communities. So working with them and effecting change, as you say, through the governor, the chief minister of Odisha, who granted land rights, and working with those communities and transforming them from within. And then, of course, if the answer to those people in California, the 2.5 million in an advanced society, is decentralizing literally electrical energy, then longer term, demonstrating that you don't have to bring a power grid or a sewage system to a remote community, but you can transform it from within, and you can use modern technology to bring those standards up to everybody else. So in a way, there is a very powerful connection between the developed so-called world and the emerging economies.
And of course, another aspect is not only the future of cities, it's also the future of infrastructure and transport. And we had a great conversation a few months ago about the future of trains, that train traveling is becoming more important. And when I grew up, night trains played a big role. One could go literally everywhere in Europe by night train. And at that moment, of course, when also it's interesting again to look into the Roosevelt plan of the New Deal of Roosevelt. Helen Levitt was always telling me, when should there be a big crisis one day, we should sort of learn from these projects, not only the cultural projects, but also the infrastructure project. That, of course, raises that question: what kind of infrastructures will we need for a new Green Deal? And you were particularly interested in this idea of night trains or trains. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, infrastructure is about investment for future generations. You know, we take for granted the facilities in terms of modern drainage and the civic splendor of the embankment in London. That was hastened by the cholera epidemics in the middle of the 19th century. So that had the effect of expediting an investment in infrastructure. It would be fantastic if this pandemic had a similar effect. And the kind of New Deal that you talked about, that extraordinary period in American history, which followed the Great Depression of 1929, the arts had a binding influence on communities. It created the concept of community centers related to the arts. And it's quite fascinating that the artists who were the big names after World War II were in many ways discovered through those programs. I mean, people like Rothko, household names, were young artists at that time. And the idea that you would use federal money, in other words, state funds, to invest in infrastructure, and that infrastructure would be more noble by virtue of its engagement with the arts. And we can see that in the heritage in New York, in Rockefeller Center, which was a private initiative, but it was very much in that same spirit.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, so many extraordinary artists: Philip Gaston, Pollock, Alice Neal, Lee Krasner. Lee Krasner always said that she would never have survived, without these programs. And Jacob Lawrence, they all got their beginning through that schemes. And so it was a very important project, indeed. We're going to open it soon now for questions from our amazing group. I had one or two very last questions. One thing I wanted to ask you is, because of course, at the moment, it has a lot to do with change. And actually, you have a motto, and it's not only your motto, it's the Foster family motto, that the only constant is actually change. Can you explain that motto to us?
Well, whether it is, we talked about Odisha, whether it is seeing a community there be part of a workshop and being party to, from a bottom-up approach to changing their community, or whether it is the effect of quite massive change through, if you took the Bloomberg building or a Hearst building, you're bringing together people under one roof who've never really worked together, creating a totally new community. And I think that the thing perhaps why, as an architect, you're an optimist, is you see the transformative effect of a change. It can be, in many ways, a relatively small change that has a big effect. If you take, say, Trafalgar Square, before the initiative, probably about 2 decades ago, to close one side of it, people would never believe it if you revisited it now as a traffic roundabout, with all the dangers, the fumes, the smells, the deserted heart of that. So I think that the change for the better, design in the end is about positive change.
That is such a great conclusion. One very last question is, of course, about this time, these weeks and months now of self-isolation. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit what you're working on, what you've been working on over these last 2 months, what you're working on at the moment, and also what you find most inspirational and empowering right now.
I'm probably working on about 20 projects. I spend quite a lot of time in front of a rather larger screen than the one in front of me at the moment, with lots of images. I'm hugely impressed the way that kind of human ingenuity, extraordinary flexibility, the way that individuals have adapted to working at home. And in some cases, those, are they're quiet places. In other cases, with young children running around, they're pretty demanding. So I think that's one aspect. The other is I'm never in my life stayed in one place for so long. As a way of life, I move around. I'm mobile. So it's a period of perhaps more reflection. Paradoxically, longer working hours, but very privileged in all kinds of ways to be in a place and to have the space to be able to explore, to do some things that I haven't done for a long time, to re-immerse myself in a drawing, and to divide my time between writing, design, projects. It's a period of, I think, some introspection.
Thank you so much, Norman, for this amazing conversation and this amazing positivity and hope for a better world in the future. And of course, we are so grateful to all the participants who are with us, because I think there is a great need to come together, to support one another, also about art, architecture, imagination, and as you've showed us today, spread this message of positivities.